بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. The author rahimahullah goes on to mention باب أقسام المياه التي يجوز منها الوضوء, the chapter which mentions the different types of water in regards to what is permissible to use for wudu. أقسام المياه, the different types of water. And so he goes on to say اعلم وافقك الله تعالى, يعني know, and may Allah give you tawfiq, أن الماء على قسمين مخلوط وغير مخلوط. يعني know that there are two different, that water can be split into two categories, على قسمين مخلوط وغير مخلوط. يعني what he means here is that water can be split into two categories. The word مخلوط means mixed, وغير مخلوط means and not mixed. So here he's going to talk about the fact that there's two types of water. Either the water is mixed with something else, or the water is pure in itself, meaning that it hasn't been mixed with anything else, or water that has been mixed with a substance. Then he goes on to say فَأَمَّا غَيْرُ الْمَخْلُوطِ فهو طهور وهو الماء المطلق يجوز منه الوضوء سواء نزل من السماء أو نبع من الأرض. He says that he mentioned that there's two types of water, and he says فَأَمَّا غَيْرُ مَخْلُوطِ, as for the water that hasn't been mixed with any other substance, meaning that it's yani pure water, فَهُوَ طهور. He says فَهُوَ طهور, and the word طهور means that it is pure in itself and has the ability to purify. That's what we mean when we use the word ma'un طهور, that it is pure in itself, meaning that it is pure in itself and that it is able to purify. And he says وَهُوَ الْمَاءُ الْمُطْلَقُ, yani the technical term of this water in fiqh is called al-ma' al-mutlaq, absolute water. So you can call it ma' al-tuhur, or you can call it al-ma' al-mutlaq. Alright, so that's why he says wa huwa al-ma' al-mutlaq. And then he gives you the hukm of the water. What is the ruling of the water? Yajuzu minhu al-wudu. It is permissible to use this type of water for wudu. سواء نزل من السماء أو نبع من الأرض. He says regardless of whether this water, this pure water, comes from the sky, نزل من السماء أو نبع من الأرض, or comes forth from the earth, which means he's referring to wells and springs. So that's what he means here. I mean, what he just mentioned here is the ruling of water that is غير مخلوط. يعني غير مخلوط is water that hasn't been mixed. فهو طهور وهو الماء المطلق, and when we call it absolute water, يجوز منه الوضوء. It is permissible to make wudu from it. Now he's going to go on to talk about water that is mixed, and he says وأما المخلوط, as for the water that has been mixed, إذا تغير أحد أوصافه الثلاثة لونه أو طعمه أو ريحه بشيء فهو على قسمين. Then he says here, as for water that is مخلوط, if it were to change in one of three characteristics, يعني أحد أوصافه الثلاثة, and these three characteristics that he's talking about is its color, لونه, أو طعمه, its taste, أو ريحه, and its smell. So what he's referring to here is when we're talking about water that has been mixed with something, then we have some questions to ask. Because either that water that has changed, how do we determine that it's changed? What are the determining factors? Either it's changed in color, taste, or smell. So he says, if it changes in color, taste, or smell, bishay'in, by something, فَهُوَ عَلَى قِسْمَيْن, then we're going to split this water into two different types, into two categories again. So now that we're looking at ma al-makhluq, al-makhlut, that water that is mixed with something, we're going to split that into two categories. He goes on to say, تَارَةً يَخْتَلِطُ بِنَجِسٍ فَيَتَغَيِّرُ بِهِ فَالْمَاءُ نَجِسٌ لَا يَصِحُّ مِنْهُ الْوُضُوء. He said, in one of the cases, this water will be mixed with an impure substance. يَخْتَلِطُ, to be mixed, بِنَجِسٍ, and it is mixed with najis, an impurity. Right? So when it is mixed with an impurity, فَيَتَغَيَّرُ, and then it changes, and we mentioned that the change is either in color, taste, or smell. فَالْمَاءُ, then that water is najisun. Okay, the hukm of that water is that water becomes impure. And what do we mean by it's impure? لَا يَصِحُّ مِنْهُ الْوُضُوء. It is not permissible to make wudu from that water. Okay, so that's under the circumstance that impurity changed the characteristics of the water. Now, what if it did not change the characteristics of the water? The author is going to go on to mention this ruling now by saying, وَإِن لَمْ يَتَغَيَّرْ بِهِ فَإِن كَانَ الْمَاءُ قَلِيلًا وَالنَّجَاسَةُ قَلِيلَةً كُرِهَ الْوُضُوءُ مِنْهُ عَلَى الْمَشْهُورِ. So what he's saying here is, if this mixed water that has been mixed with an impurity did not change, and the water is a little bit, and the najasa is a little bit. For example, let's just say you had a bucket of water for wudu, or a pail for making a ghusl, a complete body washing, and a piece of an impurity was to fall inside the water, like blood. Okay, so we have a small amount of water and we have a small amount of impurity. So you could not smell, taste, or see any change, or a couple drops of urine. This water would be permissible to make wudu from, but it would be disliked. Okay? Now the condition of the dislike is under the condition that you cannot find purifying water. If you cannot find purifying water, then it is not disliked. So he says here, that's why he says here, وَإِن لَمْ يَتَغَيَّرْ, if it did not change bihi, and with that impurity, فَإِن كَانَ الْمَاءُ قَلِيلًا, if the water was a little bit, وَالنَّجَاسَةُ قَلِيلَةً, and the najasa was a little bit, كُرِهَ الْوُضُوءُ مِنْهُ عَلَى الْمَشْهُورِ, according to the mashhur opinion, it would be disliked. The reason why it says عَلَى الْمَشْهُورِ is because we have a weak opinion that says that even if a small amount of impurity were to fall inside of it, and even if it weren't to change, then it would still be impure. But that's the weak opinion. When we say mashhur means the sound or the popular opinion in the school, but technically it means the opinion which it is obligatory to give fatwa by. That's what we mean when we say al-mashhur. So also another thing that we notice in the text, the author says فَإِن كَانَ الْمَاءُ قَلِيلًا, if the water is a little bit and the najasa is a little bit, and it were to change. Yani, what is to be understood, that if the water was a lot, then more so the rule would be that the water would be disliked to use as well. But the reason why I mentioned little was to let you know that even if it was a lot of water, then the ruling would be the same. So then he moves on to talk about the water that is mixed with a purity. So the first thing that we talked about was water that was mixed with an impurity, and we talked about its ruling. Now we're going to talk about when it's mixed with a purity. He says, وَتَارَةً, and sometimes يَخْتَلِطُ بِطَاهِرٍ, and sometimes it is mixed with a pure substance, فَيَتَغَيِّرُ بِهِ, and so it changes because of that pure substance. So he says, فَإِن كَانَ الطَّاهِرُ مما يمكن الاحتراز منه كالماء المخلوط بالزعفران والورد والعجين وما أشبه ذلك فهذا الماء طاهر في نفسه غير مطهر لغيره فيستعمل في العادات من طبخ وعجن وشرب ونحو ذلك ولا يستعمل في العبادات. Here he says, if the water is mixed with the pure substance and were to change, if that pure substance is something مما يمكن الاحتراز منه, here if this pure substance is something which it is not مما يمكن الاحتراز منه, meaning it is something in which it is possible to avoid. In other books they use a different term. In other books they're going to use a term that says a substance that's not considered part of it in most cases. ما ينفك عنه غالبا. This is the terminology that Al-Akhdari uses, and it's a bit more clear. What he's referring to when he says مما يمكن الاحتراز منه is any type of pure substance that falls inside that water that is possible to be avoided. And what do we mean by possible to be avoided? That is not considered part of water in most cases. And he gives an example. For example, saffron or roses or flour. And in Al-Akhdari he gives you other examples like milk. All these things, although they're pure, they're not considered part of water. So this is the hukm that he's giving you by saying kalma il makhluti, like water that is mixed biza'afarani. Za'afarani means saffron. Wal wardi, roses. Wal ajin means dough, or you can say flour. Wama ashbaha, and anything like it. Dhalik. And what does he mean by anything like it? Anything that's not considered part of water, meaning that it's avoidable. فَهَذَا الْمَاءُ, that water is pure, meaning that the water is pure fi nafsihi, meaning in its essence the water is still pure because it hasn't been mixed with the purity, but غَيْرُ مُطَهِّرٍ لِغَيْرِهِ, but it cannot bring about purity. What do you mean by we cannot bring about purity? It won't, if you make wudu from it, it won't bring you out of the state of hadath, meaning it won't lift the non-state of wudu. So when we say that the water is pure in itself, it means that although it's mixed with something, it's not mixed with an impurity. So it is pure for itself, but it is not able to purify other things. Right? So, for example, if you had an impurity in your carpet, you couldn't use rose water to remove it, according to the Malikis. You have to use purifying water. So that's why he says, فَيُسْتَعْمَلُ فِي الْعَادَاتِ min tabkhin wa ajnin wa shurbin wa nahwi dhalik. So, what is the hukm of this water? What is the ruling of this water? This water can be used for customary usage. That's what he means by fil adati min tabkhin, like cooking, wa ajnin, baking, using the water for cakes or cooking and so on and so forth, wa shurbin, and drinking, wa nahwi dhalik. Any type of customary usage, you can use it because it's a purity. You can use anything that's pure, but you're not allowed to use things that are impure. But he says, وَلَا يُسْتَعْمَلُ فِي الْعِبَادَاتِ, but it cannot be used in things that are considered worship. And the way that we consider something worship are those things that necessitate that you make a niyyah. For example, he says, لَا فِي wudu. For example, you can't make it for wudu because wudu is as an ibadah. وَلَا فِي غَيْرِهِ, and not in other than it, in other things like it. So what he means وَلَا فِي غَيْرِهِ, like ghusl, when after sexual intercourse, when you're making ghusl, you have to make niyyah. So you cannot use it in order to remove, you cannot use it to make ghusl or istinja. When you're washing your private parts after using the water, this type of water cannot be used as well. Now he's going to talk about the issue of the water if it is from a substance that is not يعني لا ينفك عنه غالبا, as is mentioned in Al-Akhdari. In this book he uses the word مما لا يمكن الاحتراز منه, those things which are not avoidable. In other words, those things that are not avoidable in water, which means because they're part of water in most cases. Like salt. Salt is considered part of water. And so they do not harm water. Or mud on a beach, mud is considered part of water. or seaweed, it's considered part of water. So if these things change the color or the taste or the smell of water, it doesn't affect the fact that it can be used for wudu. That's why it says wa in kana, meaning in kana, if that purity was mimma la yumkinu al-ihtirazu minhu, if it was from those things in which لا يمكن الاحتراز منه, meaning those things in water which are not possible to avoid, which means that they're part of water in most cases. And he's going to give you an example, كالماء المتغير بالسبخة, like water that changed because of salt. So when you go to an ocean, you can make wudu from that water because that salt is unseparable from the water. Right? And so the Malikiyah will say, even if a person was to take table salt, or real salt, and throw it inside of the water, then it wouldn't destroy the purity of it because it's considered something that's part of water. Or seaweed. You go to a swamp, you see water, it's green. You can make wudu from it because it's considered part of water in most cases. Or minerals. You find water in a stream that's running, and the minerals like zinc or something, or so on and so forth, have caused it to change color, then in this case the water would still be pure because it's considered part of water in most cases. So that's what the author means here when he says kalma al-mutaghayr bis-sabakhati or ham'ati. Ham'ati means mud. And so if you're at a place where there's mud and there's a water pond in it, and the water is brown because of the mud, then this water is still permissible to use for, or I shouldn't just say permissible, but perfectly fine to use for wudu. And he says, وَنَحْوِ ذَلِكَ أَوْ الْجَارِ عَلَى الْمَعْدِنِ الزِّرْنِيخٍ أَوْ كِبْرِيتٍ أَوْ نَحْوِ ذَلِكَ. Or he says, or any stream of water that is running through minerals like zirnichin. And zirnichin, the translation of zirnichin is arsenic, arsenic, which is some type of mineral that I'm not actually familiar with, or kibritin, sulfur. So if there was some type of stream that was running over these minerals, like as you would see in some places in valleys where there's creeks and there's streams, and it were to change the color of water, because this thing is what is inseparable from water, or part of water in most cases, then these things do not damage the purity of the water. Or nahwihi, that's why he says fahadha, meaning all of what we just mentioned, kulluhu tuhurun, all of it is tuhurun. And we mentioned the technical term for tuhur, make sure tuhur, that it is water that is pure in itself and it is able to purify. That's why it says yasihhu minhu al-wudu wallahu a'lam, and it is pure for wudu and Allah knows best, which they mention out of adab. And also what he doesn't mention here, which is mentioned in other books like Al-Aziyah, as well as the fact that it is permissible to use for wudu, it is also permissible to use for customary usage. But the reason why he doesn't mention it here is because if we go back, we notice that what he's focusing on is the water which is permissible for a person to make wudu from. And so that is the end of the section on water that is permissible to be used for wudu. So to summarize in general, as long as the water is pure and it is able to purify, it can be used for wudu. So the first thing that he mentioned was absolute water. Absolute water, water that comes right out of your tap, that is purifying water, can be used for wudu and can be used for customary usage. There's no problem. When we come down to mixed water, we have mixed water that is mixed with an impurity. If it's mixed with an impurity and it causes the color to change, or any of the characteristics that we mentioned to change, then that water cannot be used for customary usage and it cannot be used for wudu because it's an impurity and it is not permissible to use impurities. But there's one mas'ala in our madhab that according to the mashhur opinion, if we had a small amount of water, thus more so even if it was a lot of water, and a small amount of an impurity was to fall inside of it and not change the taste, color, or smell, it's disliked to use the water. But mentioned in Al-Izziyah, what she didn't mention here, which Al-Izziyah is a book on top of Al-Ashmawiyyah, or a more advanced book than Al-Ashmawiyyah, mentions that a person, that this using this water would be disliked under the condition that there's no other water present. So if there is no other water present, that there's pure water present, it'll be disliked if you have the ability to get pure water. But if you don't have the ability to get purifying water, then it is not disliked. Then we moved on to talk about water that is mixed with a purity. And we split it into two categories. Either that purity is something that's not considered part of water, which the terminology that I said they use here is the terminology that says something that is difficult to be avoided from water, but in other books it will mention مَا لَا يَنْفَكُ أَنْهُ غَالِبًا, something that's not considered part of water in most cases, which is a better term, and I'll clarify the reason for that. Then that water can be used for customary usage, but it can't be used for wudu. And then we have the water that is changed by something that is considered part of water or inseparable from water, like mud and minerals and so on and so forth, and seaweed, as mentioned in Al-Izziyah. Al-Izziyah also mentions fish. If there's fish in water and it changes the color, then it also does not remove the fact that the water is tuhur. Then this water is obviously okay for wudu, and it's okay for customary usage. The reason why I said the term that in مَا لَا يَنْفَكُ أَنْهُ غَالِبًا, that which is not considered part of water, it's that which is considered part of water in most cases is a better terminology, because this answers our question to chlorine. A person will say, well, when we turn on our tap, our water changes in taste because there's chlorine. But as the text mentions in Al-Akhdari, that anything that is considered part of water in most cases, meaning the norm is that it is considered part of water, then that water will not be disturbed or will not change from the fact that it is being purified, because nowadays chlorine is considered part of water in most cases. You can't go anywhere and find water that does not have chlorine in it. So chlorine has now become like a mineral. So let's just say somewhere down the line in life, some scientists discover that roses is good for water, and then all around the world, everybody's water is coming out tinted red. So now, because this has become a norm and it has become an ada, then we will consider that this water is still pure because the substance is pure and it's from something that's inseparable from water. And Allah, who knows best. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een.